in the middle of a Tuesday morning in the main lobby in front of everyone. Brianna Cole called out a name across the open floor. The name belonged to Elliot Hayes, the janitor who had spent months moving quietly through the building like a shadow no one bothered to look at twice. She told him he was fired. She pulled the badge from his chest. She told him to leave the building immediately. Elliot didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He looked at her and asked one question. "Are you sure?" 30 seconds later, every monitor in the building changed at once, and the man she had just fired was the only person in the room who didn't look surprised. The building that housed Callaway Group's regional headquarters was the kind of place that looked impressive from the outside and felt airless once you were in it. 42 floors of glass and steel in the middle of downtown, with a lobby that echoed and a security desk that logged every entry and exit. The elevators moved fast, the meetings ran long, and somewhere in the unwritten rules of the place, everyone understood that the way to survive was to stay in your lane, keep your head down, and never make yourself a problem for the people above you. Most employees learned that lesson within their first month. A few never had to learn it at all. They arrived already shaped for exactly this kind of environment, the kind where performance reviews carried more weight than human decency, and where the phrase, "we're all a family here," had been emptied of every meaning it once held. Elliot Hayes had been working in the building for just over 7 months. He came in before most of the staff arrived and left after most of them had gone. He wore a gray uniform with his name stitched in white thread above the left breast pocket. He mopped floors, replaced trash liners, restocked supply closets, wiped down surfaces in conference rooms after meetings ended. He did his work without drawing attention to himself, and no one offered him any. In a building of several hundred people, he was the kind of presence that registered only when something was out of place, and since nothing was ever out of place around him, most employees couldn't have told you what he looked like if asked. He was simply part of the building, the way the ventilation system was part of the building. Functional, unremarkable, easy to ignore. That was exactly how he wanted it. Brianna Cole had been operations director at Callaway Group for 3 years, and in that time, she had reshaped the department in her image, which was to say, efficient, pressurized, and unforgiving of anything that looked like weakness or error. She was not the kind of manager who yelled. She was worse than that. She spoke in a measured, deliberate tone that made every correction feel like a verdict, and she delivered criticism in front of audiences because she believed, or at least operated, as though she believed that public accountability was the most effective form of behavioral correction. Her staff had learned to brace themselves whenever she walked through the floor with that particular expression on her face, the one that meant someone was about to have a very bad morning. She was 39, sharp-dressed, and completely certain of her position within the company's hierarchy. She had numbers on her side. Her department consistently hit targets. Upper management left her alone, which she interpreted as endorsement. In the ecosystem of Callaway Group's regional office, she was by every visible metric untouchable. On the morning everything changed, it started with something almost comically small. Elliot had been finishing his rounds on the 4th floor when he moved his cart past the hallway that led to the open plan section of the operations team. The floor had been buffed the night before, slightly too much product applied near the side corridor, leaving a faint residue that caught the light at a certain angle. It wasn't slippery. It wasn't a hazard. It was the kind of thing that would have gone unnoticed by anyone not specifically looking for it. Brianna Cole noticed it. She was returning from a morning briefing with 2 of her senior coordinators when she stopped mid-stride and looked down at the floor. She looked at it for a moment, then looked up and spotted Elliot at the end of the corridor, guiding his cart toward the service elevator. She called his name. Not loudly, but clearly the way someone calls a name when they want to be certain there's no confusion about who is being addressed. Elliot turned. By the time she reached him, 3 members of her team had slowed their pace to watch. Within the next minute, As her voice carried across the open floor, a dozen more employees had stopped what they were doing. The floor was the kind of layout where sound traveled easily. Low partitions, hard ceilings, nowhere for noise to disappear. Brianna stood in front of Elliot and told him the floor was unacceptable. She told him that she had walked past this exact corridor 3 days in a row and found it below standard each time. She told him that it reflected a pattern of carelessness that she was no longer willing to accommodate. Her tone was controlled, but the volume was deliberate. She was not speaking only to him. Elliot listened without interrupting. He didn't cross his arms or shift his weight or look away. He stood with the kind of stillness that could be read as submission, though something in his expression suggested it was something else entirely. Brianna told him that his employment was terminated, effective immediately. She told him to surrender his access badge and leave the building before noon. Then, with a precision that felt rehearsed, she reached forward and unclipped the badge from his chest herself, the one with his name on it, white thread on gray, and held it in her palm. No one on the floor said anything. A few people looked at their screens. A few more looked at the floor. One woman near the window turned fully away, as if suddenly very interested in something happening outside on the street. Elliot looked at the badge in Brianna's hand. Then he looked at her. He said, "Are you sure?" His voice was quiet. It wasn't a challenge exactly, but it wasn't submission either. It had the quality of a question asked by someone who already knows the answer and is giving the other person one last opportunity to find it themselves. Brianna said yes. She told him there was nothing further to discuss and that building security would escort him out if he needed assistance locating the exit. She turned and walked back toward her office without looking back. For a few seconds, Elliot didn't move. He stood in the middle of the corridor with his cart beside him and his name in someone else's hand, and he did nothing. Employees who caught his eye looked away quickly. The floor had gone quiet in the specific, uncomfortable way it goes quiet when people know they've witnessed something wrong and have collectively decided not to acknowledge it. That silence was its own kind of statement, though no one in the room was prepared to admit that. Then from somewhere across the open floor, not one screen, not two, but every monitor in the department, a notification appeared simultaneously. A soft alert tone followed the kind the system used for company-wide broadcasts, except this one wasn't coming through the usual channel. It was coming from somewhere else entirely. The message on every screen was the same, and it was addressed not to a department or a team, but to the building. Employees exchanged glances. Someone said something under their breath. Someone else stood up from their desk and leaned toward their screen, as if proximity would help them understand what they were reading. Elliot had not moved toward the elevator. He had not called anyone. He had simply remained where he was, watching the room react his expression the same as it had been since the moment Brianna called his name, unreadable, unhurried, and entirely without surprise. He reached into the front pocket of his uniform and removed a small, flat device, not a phone, something more compact, and placed it back in his pocket after a single glance. Then he straightened his collar, positioned himself near the edge of the corridor, where he had a clear view of the main floor, and waited. The monitors didn't go dark. They stayed lit, and what was on them continued to change. The alert tone hadn't finished echoing before Brianna Cole was back on the floor. She had made it to the glass partition outside her office when she heard the sound, that single flat chime that the internal system used for company-wide broadcasts. And then she heard it, again and again, because it wasn't stopping. She turned around and saw what her staff was seeing every monitor in the department, displaying the same notification. A broadcast that hadn't been authorized by anyone in her team, sourced from an access level that had no business being active on a Tuesday morning without her knowledge. Her expression didn't break into alarm. It tightened into something colder and more deliberate, the face of someone who has just identified a problem and is already moving toward it. She crossed the floor toward the IT station, a cluster of desks near the far wall, where a man named Greg handled system support for the department. She told him to kill the broadcast. She told him to lock down whatever access point was pushing it, and to trace the source immediately. Greg pulled up the system panel on his workstation, his fingers moving quickly across the keyboard, and then his hand slowed. He stared at the screen. He typed something else. He stared again. Brianna asked him what the problem was. Greg told her carefully that the broadcast wasn't coming through any of the standard internal channels. It was being pushed through an administrative access level he didn't have the clearance to override. He said he could try to reroute, but that it would take time, and whoever had initiated this had done it from a layer of the system that sat above his permissions. Brianna told him to try anyway, and to call the central IT desk for escalation. Then she turned back to the floor. Her staff was still at their desks, but no one was working. They were reading. Every screen in the department was still lit with the same message, and in the time it had taken Brianna to reach Greg and back, more employees had stood up from their chairs to look the way people stand, when something on a screen is too significant to process while sitting down. A few of them had already started talking to each other in low voices, the kind of low that isn't really quiet at all. Brianna told the room in the voice she used when she needed compliance immediately that everyone should return to their workstations and that IT was handling a technical issue. She said it would be resolved shortly. She said there was nothing on those screens that required their attention. No one sat down. It was a small thing, not a confrontation, not a refusal, just a room full of people who remained standing when she told them to sit. But in 3 years of running this department, Brianna had never experienced that before, and she felt it with a precision that had nothing to do with the monitors or the system alert. She felt it as a shift. Something had moved, and she hadn't been the one to move it. Across the floor near the corridor where the whole morning had begun, Elliot Hayes still hadn't left. He stood at the edge of the open floor, with his cart beside him, watching. He wasn't on a phone. He wasn't speaking. He had the quality of someone who has planned for exactly this moment and finds it unfolding, more or less according to expectation. The data on the screens had started to expand. What began as a single notification had opened into a layered display, documents file, names, timestamps, communications. Employees who leaned close enough to read them went quiet in a different way than before. Not confused, quiet. The specific quiet of people who are reading something they recognize. One of the senior coordinators on Brianna's team, a woman named Dana, who had been with the department for close to 2 years, stood up from her desk and looked at Brianna directly. Dana said in a voice that was controlled, but not soft, that what she was looking at on her screen was a set of internal files she had been told didn't exist. She said one of the documents appeared to be an email chain directing her team to adjust overtime records before the quarterly audit. She said her name was in that chain. She said she had flagged the situation to Brianna in writing twice 7 months ago and had been told both times to drop it. The room got very still. Brianna told Dana that this was not the appropriate venue for that conversation, and that if Dana had concerns about internal procedure, there were established channels for raising them. Her tone remained flat and controlled, but the sentence had arrived a fraction of a second too late to land the way she needed it to, because by then, someone else was already speaking. A younger analyst named Trevor, seated 2 rows back, said that he was looking at an email in his own name, a message he had been required to send to an external auditor last spring, walking back a discrepancy report he had flagged. He said the original version of that report was also on his screen, now next to the revised one. He said the differences were significant. Then another voice. Then another. Not a wave, more like a sequence, one person at a time, each one naming something they recognized from what was on their screen. Overtime hours logged and then deleted. Compliance reports amended after submission. a record of formal complaints filed internally and then closed without review, the closures attributed to a single authorization code that traced back to one office on this floor. No one was yelling. The room was almost eerily calm, the way a room gets when the thing that's been unsaid for a long time finally gets said, and everyone realizes at the same moment that they all already knew. Brianna opened her mouth. A voice from the corridor said, "That's enough." It was quiet, and it was clear, and it carried the kind of authority that has nothing to do with volume. Everyone on the floor turned toward the sound. Elliot Hayes had moved to the center of the open floor. He had left his cart at the edge of the corridor. He stood with his hands at his sides, still in the gray uniform, still with the blank space on his chest where the badge had been, and he looked at Brianna Cole with an expression that was almost impersonal, not hostile, not triumphant, simply direct. He told her his name. He told her that he was the controlling shareholder of Callaway Group and the primary owner of record on the founding documents. He told her that he had been present in this building for 7 months, in a capacity that allowed him to observe operations without interfering in the daily structure, and that what he had observed during those 7 months had been enough to initiate a formal internal review, which was what was now playing out on every screen in the department. The room was completely silent. Brianna stared at him. Something moved across her face, not quite recognition, not quite disbelief, something in between, like a person trying to fit a piece into a puzzle and finding that the shape is correct, but the location is completely wrong. She said that was not possible. She said she knew every stakeholder in this company, that ownership at that level was documented and disclosed, and that nothing about this man. She gestured briefly at the uniform, was consistent with what he was claiming. Elliot told her she was welcome to check the corporate registry. He said the access level that was currently controlling every monitor in the building was tied to his credentials, and that if she needed further confirmation, she could contact the company's legal counsel, whose number was listed in the system under his name, not hers. Someone on the floor pulled up the registry. It took about 40 seconds. The employee, a coordinator named Marcus, who handled compliance documentation, read the screen twice, then looked up and said quietly that the name matched. Brianna's posture didn't collapse. She was not the kind of person who collapsed, but something in her stillness changed it, became a different kind of stillness, the kind that is no longer chosen. She told Elliot that she was prepared to discuss whatever concerns he had about her management of the department, but that the way this had been handled was inappropriate, that displaying private communications on company monitors without authorization was a potential legal violation, and that she intended to speak with counsel immediately. Her voice was still even. She was still reaching for the levers she knew how to use. Elliot said, "You just fired me." He said it without inflection. He wasn't reminding her of the emotional weight of the moment. He was simply naming what had happened, the way you name a fact in a room where someone is trying to introduce alternative versions of events. Brianna said that she had acted within her authority as operations director to manage personnel on her floor. Elliot said that her authority as operations director had been suspended 8 minutes ago at the administrative level, pending the outcome of the review. He said her access credentials had been locked by the same system she had just asked Greg to override, and that the reason Greg hadn't been able to do it was that the lock had been placed by a clearance level that didn't answer to her. Brianna looked at Greg. Greg looked at his screen, then back at her, and gave a single, almost imperceptible shake of his head. The access was locked. He couldn't touch it. For a moment, Brianna said nothing. The calculation was visible, not her emotions. But the process, the rapid assessment of what moves remained, which exits were still open, whether there was still a version of this that ended differently. She looked at the room. She looked at Dana, who met her gaze and didn't look away. She looked at Marcus, who had turned his monitor slightly so the registry page was visible to the people around him. She told the room that the documents being displayed were being taken out of context and that she would not be making any further statements without legal representation present. It might have worked under different circumstances. In a room that hadn't already spent 7 months accumulating things, it wasn't allowed to say. It didn't work here. Dana spoke again. She said she was formally requesting that HR be notified and present. She said it on behalf of herself and named 3 other employees who nodded when she said their names. She said she had documentation, her own documentation kept separately outside the company system, and that she was prepared to submit it. Greg made a call. He didn't ask Brianna for permission. He called the Human Resources Department on the main building line and told them they were needed on the 4th floor immediately. Brianna stood in the center of the room she had run for 3 years, and for the first time in as long as anyone on that floor could remember, she had nothing left to say that the room was willing to receive. The monitors were still lit. The documents were still there. The employees were still standing. And Elliot Hayes, in a gray janitor's uniform, with a blank space where his badge used to be, stood at the center of it all and waited unhurried, unreadable, and entirely in control of what happened next. The HR director arrived on the 4th floor 11 minutes after Greg's call. Her name was Sandra Oakes, and she came with 2 members of her team, both carrying tablets, both moving with the focused efficiency of people who had been briefed on the way up in the elevator and understood that what they were walking into required precision, not speed. Sandra had been with Callaway Group for 6 years. She had processed terminations before. She had never walked into a room where the evidence was already on every screen and the employees were already standing. She took in the floor quickly, the lit monitors, the documents still displayed Brianna Cole near the center of the room, Elliot Hayes against the far side, the employees arranged in the specific formation of people who have chosen a side without being asked to. Sandra looked at Elliot. Something in her expression indicated that she recognized him, or recognized enough to understand the shape of what had happened here, even without a full briefing. She greeted him by name, not as a janitor, not as a staff member. She used the kind of measured professional tone, reserved for someone whose position you respect and whose patience you don't want to test. Elliot acknowledged her and asked her to proceed. What followed over the next 40 minutes was not dramatic. It was administrative, methodical, and in its own way more final than anything that had happened in the preceding hour. Sandra and her team worked through the documents that had been surfaced on the monitors, cross-referencing them against the official records in the company's HR system, flagging discrepancies, time-stamping confirmations. Dana provided her personal documentation. Trevor submitted his original discrepancy report alongside the amended version he had been directed to send. 2 other employees came forward with written accounts that they had prepared in advance, as if they had been carrying them around and waiting for exactly this kind of opening. The picture that assembled itself was not complicated. It was in fact very simple, which was the worst version of this kind of thing, because simple meant it had been deliberate, and deliberate meant there was no ambiguity to shelter behind. Over time, hours had been systematically logged and then erased before quarterly reporting periods. Internal complaints had been formally filed and then closed at the director level without investigation. External auditors had received amended reports without being informed of the original versions. These were not gray areas. They were, as Sandra said quietly to her colleague at one point, not quietly enough documented violations of federal labor law and company policy, and the paper trail was intact. Throughout all of it, Brianna Cole remained on the floor. She had stopped trying to speak to the room. She stood with her arms at her sides, and her expression locked into something that had passed through anger and come out the other side, into a kind of rigid composure, the look of someone who has run out of moves and is now simply enduring. She answered Sandra's questions in short, declarative sentences. She did not volunteer information. She did not ask for anything. When Sandra asked her to confirm her authorization code on a specific directive, the one attached to the complaint closures, Brianna confirmed it, and the confirmation was logged. At one point, Brianna looked across the room toward Elliot. It was not an appeal. It was harder than that, an attempt at something she might have called accountability, though it came too late and too controlled to carry real weight. She said that she had run this department according to the pressure she had been operating under, and that the targets she had been expected to meet had required decisions that were not always clean. Elliot listened to her say it. When she finished, he said that the targets she was referring to had been set by a management structure he was responsible for, and that nothing in those targets had ever required falsifying records or suppressing complaints. He said that if the pressure had felt unsurvivable, there had been channels for raising it. He said those channels existed precisely because he had built them in years before she arrived. Brianna didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything left to say that the room hadn't already heard. Sandra prepared the termination paperwork in under 20 minutes. She set it on the table nearest to where Brianna was standing and told her that signing was not legally required at this moment, but that the termination was effective regardless, and that the documentation would be submitted to the company's legal team and the relevant regulatory bodies by end of business. Brianna looked at the paperwork for a long moment. Then she picked up the pen and signed. She didn't make a speech. She didn't look around the room. She set the pen down, picked up the bag she had left near her office partition earlier that morning, and walked toward the elevator. The floor stayed quiet as she moved through it. No one stepped aside dramatically. No one said anything. The path to the elevator was simply there, and she walked it. And when the elevator doors closed behind her, the floor let out a collective exhale so subtle it was almost inaudible, the sound of a room decompressing after years of holding its breath. Sandra told the floor that the review process would continue and that anyone who wanted to formally document their experience could schedule time with her team before the end of the week. She said all submissions would be handled confidentially and that no one should be concerned about retaliation. And she said it with the directness of someone who understood that the reason to say it explicitly was that this room had learned the hard way that assurances without teeth were not worth much. Then she looked at Elliot and asked if there was anything else he needed from her today. He said no and thanked her. Sandra gathered her team and left. Greg returned to his workstation. Dana sat down slowly, as if her legs had only just remembered that sitting was an option. Around the floor, people began to settle back into their chairs, not with the mechanical resumption of a workday, but with the careful movements of people recalibrating, trying to understand where they were now in relation to where they had been an hour ago. Elliot walked back to the corridor where his cart was still parked against the wall. He didn't make an announcement. He didn't gather the room's attention. He pulled up the system interface on the small device he carried and began working through the restoration process, closing the broadcast, returning the monitors to their standard display, confirming that the administrative locks were properly logged before being lifted. It took him about 8 minutes. When the screens returned to normal, the floor looked almost exactly as it had before the morning started. Same layout, same light, same configuration of desks and partitions. The building hadn't changed. Everything else had. At some point while he was working, Dana crossed the floor and stopped a few feet away from him. She didn't interrupt what he was doing. She waited until he had finished and looked up before she spoke. She asked him why. Not why he had done what he did today, but why he had come into the building the way he had, in a uniform, without a title, without any of the apparatus that would have made the last 7 months significantly easier for him on a personal level. Elliot thought about the question for a moment. He said that he had built this company a long time ago and had spent a long time away from it, trusting the structure he'd put in place to hold. He said he had come back because the numbers had started to look wrong. Not wrong in a way that showed up cleanly in the financial reports, but wrong in the way things go wrong when the people at the top stop believing they're being watched. He said he needed to see it from the inside, and that you couldn't see the inside of a place like this from a boardroom. You saw it from the floor. You saw it from the corridors and the service elevators and the early morning hours before most people arrived. You saw it, he said. when you were the kind of person no one bothered to look at twice. Dana absorbed that. Then she said she was sorry no one had said anything that morning when Brianna had called his name across the floor and made what she did of it. She said that wasn't right, regardless of who he turned out to be. Elliot said he appreciated that. He said the silence that morning had told him as much as the documents on the screens, that a room full of people who knew something was wrong had spent too long believing that speaking up was a worse option than staying quiet, and that changing that was going to matter more than anything else that happened today. He picked up his cart and moved it back toward the service corridor. For the rest of the afternoon, Elliot Hayes worked the building the way he always had. He made his rounds. He restocked the supply closets on the 3rd and 5th floors. He replaced the liner in the trash bin near the elevator bank on 6. He worked without drawing attention to himself, which was harder. Now people who passed him in the hallways looked at him differently, not with the blank non-recognition of before, but with a careful awareness, the kind of look that holds more information than it gives away. Nobody stopped him. Nobody treated him like someone who needed to be somewhere else. That was new. Late in the afternoon, someone from Dana's team, a coordinator named Claire, who had been with the department for 14 months, came to the 4th floor corridor with something in her hand. It was Elliot's badge, the one Brianna had taken from his chest that morning. Priya said she had found it on the floor near where it had been dropped, and that she thought he should have it back. Elliot took it from her and looked at it, the name stitched in white thread slightly bent at one corner, where it had been clipped and unclipped. He thanked her. She nodded and went back to her desk. He set the badge down on the edge of the supply station near the corridor entrance, not clipped to his uniform, just placed there flat on the surface, the name facing up. It sat there for the rest of the afternoon while he worked around it, and no one moved it. And by the time the building began to empty for the evening, it had become, in some way, that no one had discussed or agreed on exactly where it was supposed to be. Power is not the ability to silence people. It is the willingness to listen when they finally speak. And never measure a person by the position they appear to hold, because sometimes the one you most easily overlook is the one holding everything together.